Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my definitive review of the Sony FE 12-24mm F2.8 G Master lens. Now, this is kind of the big dog of Sony's ultra-wide angle, and obviously it goes wider than what many photographers need, and it's a more extreme lens. Even though Sony markets this as being small and light, that maybe is relative to other lenses that have tried to do something similar, because in an absolute sense, it's actually a fairly large and fairly heavy lens. But I do take their point. They have managed to engineer something that's pretty special here in a full frame lens that goes as wide, rectilinear, as wide as 12 millimeters, and with a maximum aperture of f2.8. While I have seen and reviewed lenses with this focal range before, I've never before reviewed one that is an f2.8 lens. Always before, it's been f4 as a maximum aperture for the zoom range. So in many ways, Sony has engineered something new and unique here. And as we're going to see, they have managed to pull it off. This is more lens, as I noted, than what some photographers need, and there's a reason why that we've already seen the 16 to 35 millimeter f2.8 G Master, as that is a far more typical wide angle zoom. For many photographers, 16 millimeters is wide enough. So this is a lens for those that either think that they need or actually need to go wider than that. And unfortunately, you're going to pay a price to get it. And that this lens retails for around $3,000 US. Here in Canada, it's closer to $4,000. And so it's a pricey lens, but as we're going to see, it is a premium lens in terms of its build, its autofocus, and its optical performance. Now today we're doing the definitive review, which means we're going to dive into everything with some detail. And if you want a quicker, more to the point review, I also have a standard review that you can check out here that will cover everything in a shorter amount of time. I want to thank the sponsor of today's episode, which is Phantom Wallet. Phantom has been a great partner and supporter of this channel. Today's episode is brought to you by Phantom Wallet, the minimalist, modern wallet that sets you free from a bulky traditional wallet while also making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. Visit phantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber. You can even customize your wallet with new accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even the Chipolo tracking integration if you're the kind of person who loses their wallet. Use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out. So we're going to start by taking a closer look at the features, the build, and the handling of this lens, and seeing what you are getting for that significant outlay of cash. Let's take a look. So first of all, we can see that like other G Master lenses, this comes with a nice nylon padded case, and so always a welcome addition. The nature of lenses like this is that they tend to have a fixed lens hood that's a built-in part of the design, and thus it necessitates this thicker kind of cap that slides over the fixed lens hood and then tensions down. Now in this case, we've got locking mechanisms that assure that it's not going to come off unless you actually release it, but that's obviously going to take more room for storing in a pocket. What we have got here is, as always with a lens like this, we've got a bulbous front element, and that's part of the basic design, and as noted, a fixed lens hood, which means that there are no traditional filters that you're going to be able to use. At the rear of the lens, we do have a cutout for using gel filters, which are kind of primitive, truth be told, and so there are third-party options like the HIDA filter system that I've demonstrated for the 14mm f1.8 that also has an adapter for this, and so you can utilize that to use higher quality filters. It's just a matter of taking out a few screws and then popping out the built-in filter holder and replacing it with the HIDA one. This is an internally zooming lens, although as I'm going to demonstrate, there is some movement of the front element and front group forward and backwards as you zoom. And so it's in its most retracted position right here at 24 millimeters. And at 12 millimeters, it is at its furthest forward position. At all times, however, it's within the constraints of the actual lens design, and so it's still considered to be internally zooming, even though there is some movement of the front element. This is a weather sealed lens, starting with a gasket at the lens mount. There are gaskets, as you can see, in all kinds of positions on either sides of the rings, by the switches, at various transitions in the lens, 11 or 12 different seal points. And so this is obviously going to be it's a professional grade lens made out of serious materials and made to be used in a variety of conditions. With the G Master lens, we've seen a fair amount of standard design elements, and we see that here. There's the focus hold button, AF/MF switch, and there are 2 rings. Now, in the case of the prime lenses, we get an aperture ring and typically some ability to declick the aperture and to control it a few different ways. With zoom lenses like this, the first ring is going to be your zoom ring. And one thing that stands out to me as I was going through my lens test looking at the zoom ring is that every one of these positions, I have actually either reviewed or owned a prime lens at each one of these. And so it's pretty amazing. You've got 6 different marked positions. Every one of them could be a prime wide angle lens, which shows you the versatility of this lens. And so the zoom ring, it works smoothly with a nice amount of damping, and so it holds the position you want. Well done there. The actual focus ring is towards the front, and I actually like the focus action here better than I did on the 14mm f1.8. I found the action on the 14mm to be a little bit on the light side. Here the damping is a little bit heavier and to me a little bit more precise. It is a linear ring, and so you can get repeatable focus results there. This lens is 137 millimeters in length. It is nearly 98 millimeters in diameter and weighs in at a fairly whopping 847 grams. And so it's certainly neither small nor lightweight. At this stage, the Sony GM formula is something that I'm quite familiar with, and you probably are as well. And so I see nothing here that really deviates from the pattern of what I would expect. There are a few unique features to a extreme wide angle lens, with the lens cap, which is always a pain, mostly because it's very hard to slip one of these in a pocket as you would with a traditional pinch style cap. But, that's the nature of the beast. It's not unique to this lens. Every such lens that I've reviewed, you're going to have to deal with a cap like that. But, at the same time, it is a bit of a pain, and you have to be a little bit more, kind of intentional about what you're going to do with this when you're out shooting with the lens. But beyond this, this is a premium lens. It's got a premium build, and it acts like it. So it is pretty much what I would expect, but I expected good things. I also expect good things these days when it comes to autofocus. And so let's dive in and see if this lens delivers according to my expectations when it comes to the autofocusing of the lens. So let's talk autofocus. Sony has basically cracked the code when it comes to developing great autofocus in their lenses by utilizing linear motors. And linear motors tend to be focus motors that go on either side of the focusing lens or focusing group and just move them quickly back and forth. Now in this case, depending on the configuration, like the last Sony lens that I reviewed was the 14mm f1.8, and it had 2 linear motors, so one on either side of the focusing group to move it back and forward. In more extreme situations like this 12-24mm f2.8, also the 135mm f1.8, where the elements tend to be bigger and heavier, more torque is needed if you're going to achieve the same level of autofocus. And so in this case, we have got quad motors, so 2 on either side of the front end of the focusing group, 2 at the rear end of the focusing group, all 4 working in harmony. And so you still get that same lightning fast, transition and deceleration. And so it's really an effective system because these linear motors, they do kind of everything quite well in that you're getting great speed, as I've already noted, but you're also getting extremely quiet performance and of course a high degree of accuracy, and that has a lot to do with the focusing system. But as Sigma figured out, in the earlier stages of their art series back on DSLRs, that if you don't have enough torque, that a lot of times you end up with focus inconsistencies. In this case, that's not a problem at all. I've seen highly consistent results, and that comes down to largely having plenty of torque to drive focus, and so you're getting it fast and quiet, but you're also getting that accuracy. And so, you know, if it comes to tracking my face, for example, as it's doing right now, I'm filming on it at the moment, and just, you know, for this section to give you a sense of how it does for tracking my face during this. But even if I'm approaching the camera and moving, you can see that focus stays really consistent and very smooth in transitioning, where there's no obvious steps or you know, jumps, but rather focus is very smooth. Also, if we take a look at focus pulls, you'll see that they are very quiet and quick and accurate as well. So all you're hearing there basically is environmental noise, and so that's the, you know, the advantage of these focus systems as they are. And so really there's nothing to complain about. And I will note, you know, as far as you know, tracking action or anything like that, you know, wide angle lenses don't put the same kind of pressure on a lens as what a telephoto does. But what I did note is that I was in this situation at the beach where we were heading back towards the parking lot. My wife and I had been out kayaking, but I had the camera, and seagull started to fly overhead. I adjusted up, I shot for the seagull, and up above there was just basically sky and the seagull, but focus was instantly on that seagull. And I was, you know, quite impressed when I zoomed into 100%, you know, on my 50 megapixel alpha 1 image, and saw just great detail on the seagull there. And so you could tell that even in that split second of reaction time, focus had locked on and gotten me the shot, even though it was just a split second that I had to kind of prep for the shot. And so, I mean, that tells me all that I need to know, that this lens is going to be perfectly fine if you're shooting weddings, you're using it for photojournalism, you know, where you need a little bit of twitch reaction time. It's going to get the job done. And really, that's all you could ask out of a focus system like that. So kudos to Sony once again. Great autofocus system in the 12 to 24mm f2.8 GM. So yes, as expected, good things there. And you know, I think that Sony's pretty much nailed the formula. And with these recent G Master lenses, I think the only G Master lens I can remember complaining about the autofocus was the 85mm f1.4 GM, which I don't think coincidentally is one of the very earliest of the G Master lenses. But in more recent years, Sony has really nailed the formula. And whenever you buy a G Master lens these days, you can know you are getting top shelf autofocus performance. So kudos to them for really delivering in that department. So how about the image quality? As I noted in our introduction, this is an extreme optical instrument in that it goes wider than what most full frame zooms have ventured to before, and certainly with this large of a maximum aperture. That means that there is a lot of extra engineering that has to go into a lens like this, and particularly when you're the first to do it, means you've got to solve the problems that obviously no one else has been able to solve previously, or they would have done it already. So has Sony managed to pull that off? Let's dive in and let's take a look. So starting off, you can see again how useful this zoom range is, being able to go from an extremely wide, I mean exceptionally wide angle of view to a much tighter at 24 millimeters. It's still wide, but as you can see, a much different kind of perspective and a much different kind of magnification. Say if you take a look at these rocks, and that gives you an idea of the flexibility. It's all wide angle, but it's extreme flexibility in how you compose a wide angle shot. Most of the basic aberrations are really well controlled here. For example, where we would look for lateral chromatic aberrations in the transitions from black to white, you can just see there's nothing there. It's very clean, no kind of fringing to be seen in that transition. Likewise, I saw no evidence of longitudinal chromatic aberrations. And so say, for example, in this, you know, the sunlight that is going through these little fine, we'll call them hairs, since I don't know the correct term, on the edges of the leaf, you can see that as that transitions to defocus, that there should be, or could be, chromatic aberrations in these, you know, bright transition areas. And there's just no evidence of it at all. They are just perfectly well controlled. Now, less perfect is the control of vignette and distortion at 12 millimeters. And I've had a few readers harping at me that it's time to get a real chart here for this, and they were right. And so I spent the money and created a new proper chart for vignette and distortion. No homemade one anymore. But anyway, you can see that there is a significant amount of barrel distortion. More importantly, however, there is a wave pattern that, as you can see, even after a manual correction, correction, there's a mustache pattern that remains. Fortunately, you do get a cleaner correction if you use the profile or the in-camera correction for JPEGs, but I always do the manual correction just because I want to actually visualize the distortion pattern. Now things get much more mild as you progress on. At 18 millimeters in the middle of the zoom range, you can see that it's inverted to a mild amount of pincushion distortion, but it's fairly linear, and you can see it corrects quite well here. And also we'll see that the vignette is about a stop or so less, and so it's also less difficult to correct. At 24 millimeters, there's a bit more of the pincushion distortion, but again, linear, easy to correct for. Vignette has lessened off, and so now we're down to no more than 2 stops at the very top, and probably a little bit less than that, so quite easy to correct for. And so really outside of the 12 millimeter position, vignette and distortion, not really a significant issue. Now, the truth of the matter is that there are relatively few competitors at 12 millimeters f2.8 to this lens. Laowa does make one, but I would say that the Sony zoom here has no problem holding its own. In the center of the frame, it is extremely sharp, and this is 50 megapixels. It's also at 200%, the way that I test and show these results. And so when I'm already starting to see this kind of grid pattern and even a hint of moire pattern, that tells me that this is a very, very high resolution, very high contrast lens. Likewise at the mid frame, all the detail that you could wish for right there. Into the corner, the MTFs show a fairly steep fall off, but frankly here in my test it doesn't look all that bad. Certainly it's softer here in the corner, but not really all that soft, and contrast doesn't look too bad either. Here's a real-world shot, 12 millimeters f2.8, and as we can see if we zoom in, the detail, even wide open, is really fantastic. Now in this case, I see more of the drop-off at infinity, to where you can see that the corners are softer, and you can see that's true on both sides, but there is somewhat of a depth of field thing working here, because we can see that, here at the right below that, it is still nice and sharp. And so that's true to some extent over here, though it looks like it's a little bit softer on the left side than what it is on the right side. But overall, that's a great amount of resolution. And if we look off towards infinity, we can see that it's still drawing out there very nicely, even at f2.8. Stopping down to f4 gives us a slight contrast boost in the center of the frame. Mid-frame was already excellent. It looks slightly more high contrast. We can see more of an improvement, however, if we look off towards the corner where contrast has improved. And we can see also our resolution has picked up a bit. Stopping on down to f5.6 makes it sharper still, to where now we're looking at a really excellent result. Now, if I look at a real-world result, f5.6, you can see that it just looks fabulous. Contrast and detail are excellent, both here and into the distance, in the foreground. It's just resolving all kinds of fine details. And so once you stop down, it becomes a non-issue. I mean, everywhere that I look, resolution is great. And so there's lots of resolution and contrast on tap here at traditional landscape apertures. Now, somewhat surprisingly, I found that the zoom lens at 14 millimeters is sharper than what the 14 millimeter f1.8 prime was, at least in the copies that I'm comparing. And so even apples to apples at f2.8, the zoom lens is noticeably sharper in the center of the frame. If we move to the mid frame, it is still noticeably sharper. And off into the corner, here is where I would say that the prime lens has the greatest advantage, to where its resolution profile is a little bit more consistent, but it's only in the corners that the actual prime lens looks better than the zoom. Stopping down to f4 gives us a boost in those corners, and if we move on to f5.6, there is another slight boost there as well. At 16 millimeters, our resolution at f2.8 is simply fabulous. That contrast is really amazing right there, and slightly better still when stopped down to f4. Mid-frame, results already excellent, very slightly improved at f4, but to fabulous levels. And like before, we see some drop-off certainly into the corner of the frame, but corners still being quite good. f4 slightly better, and at f5.6, not really all that much better, more similar than than different. Going back to a real world image, however, at f5.6, we can see that the detail looks fabulous. I mean, if you look down into the corner, you look on up here mid-frame, but all throughout all of this detail, and then as we look towards the distance, everything looks beautiful. Contrast is excellent. Overall color rendition is beautiful as well. Now at 18 millimeters, we see a slightly interesting change in that while the center performance is very good, we can see that it's not as sharp at in the center at f2.8. At f4, it's kind of back to the levels we've expected. Mid-frame looking very good and a little bit better at f4. But what's interesting is that the ratio kind of inverts in that it actually looks really, really great in the corner. Moving on to 21 millimeters, we see a pretty similar pattern to what we saw at 18 millimeters in that it's very good at f2.8, excellent by f4, mid-frame, again, good, going to slightly better. And in the corner of the frame, a similar type result in that it's good even at f2.8 and doesn't really improve significantly when stopped down. In this test, actually, the contrast has improved a bit, but resolution is maybe slightly better at f2.8 relative to f5.6. So finally at 24 millimeters, I thought just out of curiosity I'd pull in the recent Samyang AF 24mm f1.8, a lens that really exceeded my expectations. And you'll see why here, because we've seen how good this GM lens is, and the Samyang is demonstrably better in terms of performance here in the center of the frame, in the mid frame, and even off into the corners. The GM lens has still given us a really excellent result, but the Samyang was quite shocking as a value option. At 24 millimeters, we see only a mild improvement in the corner, stopping down to f4 or f5.6, and that's mostly because they're already very good results. Now, our minimum focus distance only produces a magnification of 0.14 times, which certainly isn't exceptional. However, the results are fairly exceptional. Up close, the performance is really strong, and a surprisingly flat plane of focus in that I don't see what I often do with wide-angle lenses, where there's a little tiny sweet spot of focus due to a field curvature. And so in this case, it's actually quite a good result all around, which does give it some flexibility for shooting up close things. Here's a case in point. In the early morning light, you can see that if we zoom in, our detail here is really crisp and excellent, even with a backlit subject. And in this case, because our ratio is pretty good, the bokeh quality looks quite nice here as well. Another example here where we can see as we kind of transition towards defocus that there is no really kind of ugly zone that really catches my eye, and instead we've got nice detail here on the area of focus, and then as we transition to defocus, everything is fairly smooth. And so a nice job from Sony on that front as well. This time of year is a little bit challenging for shooting astro in that it just doesn't hardly get dark. And so here is 10:30 at night, and as you can see, it's not really all that dark. But what we can see is that in the center of the frame at 12 millimeters, star point's very, very crisp, and so that's no problem there. Towards the edge of the frame, I don't see a lot of true coma with like the wings, but we do see some stretching, and that could just be a distortion related thing. But at the same time, it's certainly not a bad result for shooting the night sky, and so you're going to get not as perfectly circular points of light as you do in the center of the frame out towards the edge of the frame, but at the same time, when viewed large, 12 millimeters is so wide, no one's going to know the difference unless they were looking at a pixel level. If you zoom into 24 millimeters, you get the similar excellent result in the center of the frame, and you're going to get a slightly better result, a little less stretching towards the edge of the frame due to less distortion. I would argue, though, there's probably a hair more coma smear here, but again, it really looks quite good and certainly a very usable lens for shooting astro. One final thing that is well worth commenting on is that flare resistance is fantastic from the lens. And so with this early morning directional light, I've got a few tiny little ghosting artifacts, but contrast is held up perfectly. When stopped down, you can see there's a little bit of a prismatic, a few blobs around the the sunburst. It's a 9-bladed aperture, and so it gives us a nice looking sunburst effect. But overall, flare resistance was excellent. Here's another image, for example. This is shooting more into the evening sun, and so you can see not only do we have bright sun coming off here, but you've got a lot of reflected light, no ghosting artifacts marring the image. And this image I thought was really exceptional in that to shoot towards the seagull, I had to, kind of tilt up and shoot right into the midday sun. It was incredibly bright, but as you can see, contrast is held up beautifully, and there is just no ghosting artifacts to see. And my subject, contrast is held up perfectly on the subject. That's a really, really impressive result. So to answer the question that we posed before entering that section, I think the answer is clearly yes, that Sony has managed to pull this off. Yes, there's certainly some distortion at 12 millimeters, and in some shots I did see a little bit of stretching of objects towards the very edge of the frame that, is somewhat dependent on the perspective of the lens. But, because there is some distortion and it's an extreme focal length, you do end up with a slightly unnatural stretching along the corners in some situations. But again, that's par for the course with a lens like this. And what I noted is as soon as you start zooming in, the distortion diminishes, the vignette diminishes, and this actually throughout most of the zoom range has very, very few optical flaws that you could point to. And in this case, I actually felt like the actual resolution on my charts was a little bit better than what the MTF led me to expect, where I expected a little bit more of a drop off in the corners than what I actually saw. So color me impressed with the performance of the lens. And I do have to point out before moving on that the flare resistance of this lens is truly, truly fantastic, which is huge in a lens that has such a wide angle of view, which means that there's going to be a lot of situations where there is bright lights, the sun in the frame. And so to have great flare resistance just gives you the confidence to go out and shoot in pretty much any kind of environmental condition. As I noted in the introduction, although everything about this lens is good, obviously it is a larger and it's a more expensive lens. It's a more extreme lens than what many photographers need. The truth of the matter is that when it comes to shooting landscapes, which is probably the first thing that most photographers think about with a wide-angle lens, this lens may go too wide or wider than necessary for many photographers. And the reason why I say that is that you have to shoot very intentionally to get great images out of something as wide as 12 millimeters. It's not about just shooting a scene, because if you just shoot a scene as you would traditionally, there's a good chance that it's going to feel quite empty, and a lot of the key details are going to seem too far away from the viewer to be relevant. Where you actually get the advantage out of a 12 millimeter lens is by getting up closer. And so maybe emphasizing the foreground, for example, allowing more sky into a shot than what you otherwise would, and composing to take advantage of that. Sometimes even to use the perspective distortion to emphasize something. And so you have to use it wisely. And so for many landscape photographers, unless that's kind of your style, then I think that this lens is probably not necessarily what you need. But where I really see it being incredibly useful is for those that shoot interiors. And let me give you a quick illustration of why. At the end of this focal range, which 24 millimeters is still considered to be wide angle, I shot this bathroom, which is a spacious bathroom with some nice features in it. And at 24 millimeters, everything seems really cramped and compressed, as if there's not much room there. If I go out to 16 millimeters, which is a common place where a lot of zooms start, wide angle zooms, you'll see that it's better, but it still feels a little bit cramped. If I go to 12 millimeters, I actually get a more accurate depiction of the space of the room. And in working in a more cramped space, like a bathroom, I'm able to give a better depiction of the space of what's actually available in the room. And so that's obviously a big advantage for somebody that's doing real estate photography, but also I see a great advantage for someone that is shooting in interiors. And so maybe you are you shoot models or portraits, you shoot weddings, and you're wanting to include some environmental details, architectural details in the shot. This obviously gives you a lot more versatility on how you're going to frame. Outside, you often have the opportunity to back up a little bit more if you want more in the frame. Inside, that's obviously not an option. And so this lens gives you a lot of versatility. And of course, having that larger maximum aperture of f2.8 means that you also have more versatility when it comes to your ISO performance, and that you can keep that ISO down a little bit more, get cleaner end results. And so if you are shooting that kind of work, shooting city, architecture, obviously a lens like this becomes extremely useful for things like that. And I see that as being really the true target audience for a lens like this. Hopefully this helps to define whether or not this is a lens that you need or is useful for your purposes, or if you should look at some alternative. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review. There's also linkage there to the image gallery if you want to check out more photos. There's some buying links if you're ready to take the plunge and want to purchase one for yourself. Also linkage to follow me on social media, to become a patron, or to sign up for my newsletter that comes out on Thursdays. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Ring that bell so you get notifications when new content drops. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.